Article 5 of the United States Constitution gives we the people the power to put the federal government back in its constitutional box and expand liberty for all. Once 2/3 of the states pass similar applications, a convention of states will be called and there is nothing the federal government can do to stop it. The Convention of States Action Resolution applies for an Article 5 convention that would propose constitutional reforms limited to 3 topics. First, fiscal restraints on the federal government. With over $140 trillion in unfunded liabilities, we need a balanced budget. But our resolution also allows for caps on federal spending and taxation. The second topic is limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. The Supreme Court has authorized the feds to have control over almost every aspect of our lives. The COS Action Resolution empowers us to restore the Constitution to its original intent and return power to the states and the people. Finally, term limits. Thanks to a corrupt ruling class in Washington, trust in the federal government is at an all-time low. That's why our resolution gives Convention of States commissioners the power to send the career politicians packing, including the judiciary and other federal officials. So what can you do? Sign the petition at cosaction.com and get as many of your friends and family to do the same. Get plugged in with your local Convention of States team so you can stay engaged, educate others, and respond to national calls to action. Our success depends on you, so we're inviting you to be part of history. Let's invoke the constitutional solution that's as big as the problem.
I think we're ready to go. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 10 o'clock. I appreciate all of you coming here for this today. We're going to move it along pretty fast. I have one problem, and that is that I tend to ramble. But I've got guards out here, and they're going to go like this. So if you see that, you know what they're saying. Would you please rise first for the national anthem? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And now if you'd just join me for a moment of prayer, please. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity for us to get together here and discuss issues facing our country and facing our nation. Most of all, we are grateful for the freedom and liberty that only comes from you. May we never take it for granted, and may we always give praise and worship in your name. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen.
Thank you for coming again. So, we're going to do a little bit of an introduction here first, tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Greg Tangeman. I live in Wilmer, and I've been involved in Convention of States here for about 2 years now. And also with us is Jackie Burns over here in the corner. Jackie's our state director, and we've got some other state directors and volunteers here. I was going to say everybody with a button, but everybody's got a button. So I guess we're all volunteers. That's fantastic. So a little bit about how I got started in this. I'm probably one of the guys that you would call a Reagan Democrat. I used to be very strong in the Democratic Party, and when Reagan was president, I never did vote for him. It took me a long time to come around and realize that, wait a minute, we got some other problems here. So anyway, I've been active in several different political activities, trying to get the country back on track. And in 2016, when the Republicans took all 3 branches of government, I thought, okay, now we're going to get some things changed. And of course, the first thing to do is give us one of the biggest budget deficits we've ever had in history. So that's when I got really depressed and I was really disappointed. And then I was watching The Next Revolution with Steve Hilton. And at the end of the show, and he started talking about this Convention of States thing. So then I went online and started reading about it. So what we're going to do here today is kind of introduce you also to the Convention of States. First of all, how many of you, some of you in here have already signed the petition, have signed up? Can you see a show of hands? Fantastic. So that's good. We've got, so let's go into what the Convention of States is and how it was originated. Back when the Constitution was being drafted in 1787, they'd been working on it for several months, and we're getting down to the final 2 days, and Colonel George Mason had a revelation, and he looked at Article 5, which Article 5 is the opportunity for our Constitution to evolve throughout, as the nation changes. That was the avenue where Congress could propose amendments. But he said, one thing is wrong here on this is what happens if you have a Congress that is non-responsive or becomes overbearing? What avenue does the public have for submitting resolutions? So that's when they added in there the clause for convention of states, where the states, if 37 states can call for a convention, and then to draft amendments. And then once we get to that 34 states, every state will send a commissioner, and they can send other delegates too, but every state has one commissioner that'll go to this convention. And then this convention will sit down and try to draft amendments that everybody can kind of agree on. At that point, then they bring it back to Congress, and it goes out to the states, whereby is to pass any amendment, whether it's an amendment proposed by Congress or amendment proposed by convention, it still takes 3/4 of the states to approve it. So we've got a long road ahead of us, but we've come a long way so far. When I started in this 2 years ago, I think we had 11 states, or a year and a half ago, we had 11 states, and I think now we're 15 or 16? 15. We're at 15 now. So, and a lot of the state legislatures now have ended, so we probably won't get any more till next year now when we get active again. So, what we are proposing, and we're going to go in a little bit more in detail on the Convention of States, how this all works. But what we're proposing is for the convention to come together and draft or suggest amendments to cover 3 major areas. And one is to impose fiscal constraints on the federal government. The other one is to limit the powers and jurisdiction of the federal government. And the third one is to limit terms of office. So I'm going to talk about each of those just for a couple minutes and to kind of fill you in a little bit on what we're after. Number one, the first proposal, to impose fiscal constraints on the federal government. And we've had, from the end of the Revolutionary War, it took our country 200 years to reach $1 trillion in debt. From that point, it took us 3 years to nick the $2 trillion. Now, for those of you, if you're doing the math there, at the end of the Revolutionary War to 200 years, whose administration that was in the Reagan administration. So neither party's exempt from spending money. They all seem to have a knack for it. Within this decade, I heard on a couple of weeks ago they were projecting out that at the current debt that we have, within this next decade, our interest alone on the debt will be $1 trillion for the interest alone. Think of what we could do in this country with $1 trillion if we had $1 trillion to spend. And the really sad part about it is a good chunk of that is going to China. So that's why we need to really take a look at this debt issues. We've had moving along. I read where I think it was in the Federalist magazine where they were debating about, can we raise taxes? How far can we raise taxes to cover the debt? And this was interesting to me. They said even if we went with the 70% tax rate, which is being proposed by some, and if we took all of that increase and put every dollar of it to the debt, to retire debt, and we didn't assume any more debt, it would still take us 210 years to get rid of the debt we've got. So I think we've got to reside to the fact we're always going to be in debt. We're going to be in debt, that's all there is to it. So we've got to find a way to have this country survive and not get any farther in debt. We talk about a balanced budget amendment, and I used to be a proponent of that, supporting a balanced budget. But then as I got more involved with the Convention of States, I realized that just a balanced budget could be the disaster for us. Because if we don't limit the scope of the federal government, then they'll keep spending. They'll just pass the buck and say, okay, the states have to pay for it. So a balanced budget amendment without our other three steps could be very, very detrimental to us. So that leads us to the second part of it, limiting the power and spoke of the federal government. The federal government over the years continues to continually amass more and more power, taking more power away from the states and bringing it into the federal government. And it's estimated now, nobody knows for sure, but it's estimated now that in the United States we have over 2,000 bureaucracies in the federal government, just in the federal government, which employs about 2.8 million people. That doesn't include the people who are contractors and other. That almost doubles it from that point. Excuse me. So what's so bad about big government? You know, a lot of people say, well, that's fine. The big government's not a big deal. But here's what I see, and this is probably more of my own commentary. In the history of the world, there has never been a nation with a big government where that government didn't eventually abuse its citizens. And going back to a quote from Lord Acton back in the 18th century where he said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's inevitable that would happen. So we need to attack this big government, bring it back to size, bring the powers back to the states and let us make our own decisions. Now here's something that I heard on, I think it was actually, you're going to believe this, I was actually on MSNBC. I watch that occasionally because I want to get both sides of the story. And I got in the middle of it, so I didn't get into the very start of it, but they were talking about freedom and liberty. And in citizens of, I believe it was 30 years and younger, 70% of them believe that freedom and liberty is granted them by the government. And that just about floored me. I could not believe that. Because we believe, and we say it in our Constitution, our freedom and liberty comes from our Creator. Government can only take it away. At best, they can preserve it, but they cannot grant it to us. But that speaks a lot for where we're headed here with the bigger and bigger government and the influence we're having on the younger people. And they're becoming just desensitized, that they don't understand freedom and liberty. Last weekend, we had Memorial Weekend I spent with my grandkids. I got 10 grandkids. And I was visiting with my wife one night, and I said, you know, I look at these kids, and they're little tykes, they are never going to likely experience the freedom and liberties that we did or that our grandparents did. And the thing of it is, the sad part, they probably won't even know it. They won't even know what they're missing. So, just 15-second sidebar. My wife bought me a video, and maybe you've heard of this. There's a documentary called Agenda. Have any ever heard of the Agenda? I'll tell you what, if you get that and listen to it, and if you can get it into your church, get it into your youth group. If you can get it into your school, that would be a miracle. Give it a shot. You know, who knows. But that is unbelievable, that video. It's called Agenda, and then they got another one now, Agenda 2. So get on from there. So here's something interesting, too, that I want to, I forgot, I'm going to talk about these a little bit later. Here's something else, too, that have we gone too far? Is it too far away from it? This was a ruling from the Supreme Court back in the late 90s. There was a suit brought, and in a nutshell, the suit was saying that the government is overstretching its bounds. It's getting into areas it shouldn't be. Listen to what, and the federal government ruled, the court ruled in favor of the federal government and against the petitioners. And listen to their majority ruling here. Talking about the Constitution, it says, this framework has been sufficiently flexible over the past 2 centuries to allow for enormous change in the nature of government. The federal government undertakes activities today that would never have been imaginable by our framers in 2 senses. First, because the framers would not have conceived that any government would conduct such activities, and 2, that if those activities were, they never would have believed that the federal government rather than the states would be doing it. So in other words, what they're saying there is they're just kind of throwing up their hands and saying, well, there's nothing we can do, it's passed. Well, we don't believe that. We think we can still do something, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to limit the powers of the federal government. The third one, and this one doesn't take a whole lot of time to explain, and that's to limit the terms of office of the Congress. It seems no matter what legislators bring with them to Washington, they always leave with $1 million. You know, they seem to have a knack for that. I don't know how they do it. Well, I do know how they do it. Yeah, or long-term retirement. And, you know, we've had, you know, people say, well, you know, why limit the terms? They do limit the terms. They're reelected every 6 years or every 2 years or every 4 years. And that's true. But because they have made this into a career and because they need to be reelected, the way for them to get reelected is to do nothing. Don't make waves. So, and when they spend money, instead of spending money on things that could really make a positive difference, they spend money on whatever's going to buy them a vote to keep them in power. So we are proposing, and we think the majority of the Americans also agree, that there should be a limit to terms of what we're going of office, and not only of office, but terms limits to Supreme Court judges. There's got to be a point to where when you can't stay awake, it's time to go out to pasture, you know. And but more so than that, and I feel probably bigger than those two, is limiting the bureaucracies. These people have no limits, and it's amazing how. And you'll see this. You'll kind of see this in that documentary agenda, but people just seem to keep surfacing again. I mean, the same people are in these bureaucracies, and they actually have more power than the legislators above them. They're the ones that really make the decisions and make the shots and enforce the rules. So I think we also need to bring them in and say, you know, it's time for you to change too and get somebody else in there. So there's, those are the three issues that we're working on, that we are proposing, and we've had. So let's talk about how this is all going to take place. We have, once we get to 34 states, then the convention will be called, and then we will send the delegates to the convention. It's going to take a long time to propose these amendments, and then we'll bring those out to the states to have them vote on them. Now, a question was asked to me once, well, I don't know if I want to support this because I don't know what the amendments are. Well, yeah, you don't know what the amendments are because you're getting the cart ahead of the horse in that situation. We need to have the convention first to draw people from all over the country together to have them negotiate. For example, let's just say term limits. You know, you and I could sit down on term limits, and maybe you and I could agree that it should be 2 terms for senator and maybe 5 terms for congressman. Well, but what's the other guy's going to think? And whatever, and we're going to get one shot at this. So we need to have a group of people come together and negotiate first what they think is palatable, what they think is going to work, before they take it out to the states. So that's why we need the convention. Anybody can actually draw a draft an amendment. In fact, in the history of our nation, we've had nearly 12,000 amendments have been proposed. We've only had 27 that have actually gotten voted on and brought into become part of the Constitution. So I've kind of rambled here long enough. So I want to first ask if anybody's got any questions on this. Yes.
Okay, I got you. So how do we actually hold the government accountable to the Constitution? They've shown that they don't care about the U.S. Constitution.
Good question. And I think this is one. Now this is my documentary. I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen, but this is one thing that I look at. You know, the first two we can work out pretty easy. The tough one's going to be taking the power away from the federal government. That's going to be the really tough one, to try to come up with some amendments to do that. In my opinion, where the government has gotten most out of hand is in the Commerce Clause. The Article 10 of the Constitution says that if it's not granted to the Congress in the Constitution, they cannot do it, period. That's it. But there's also Article 1, which states that the federal government, that the Congress does have authority over interstate commerce, that they can regulate interstate commerce. Well, what's interstate commerce? Well, it's money. It's money changing hands, business changing hands. Okay, well, is it healthcare? Is it welfare? Is it all those? Is it education? They bring everything into commerce and say, this is how come the federal government can control these. I think, in my opinion, if I could have any influence over the Convention of States, I would ask them, take a look at that and let's start with define what is commerce. And so they can get a narrower scope as to what they can and cannot do. I think that's the one thing.
So,
Yes.
excuse me,
Excuse
just one moment. If I could just add to that, I hear it said a lot. How can we expect Congress to follow the Constitution? They're not following it anyway. That's not true. They're following the Constitution, but they're not following the original, and we have them over there, so be sure and grab a pocket Constitution. They're not following that Constitution. They're following a nearly 3,000-page Constitution. It's called the Annotated Constitution. Every time the Supreme Court makes a ruling that alters the Constitution. So yes, they are following the Constitution, and what we're trying to do is bring the Constitution back, restore it to what it should be. So did that answer your question?
Well, not really, because we have, just look at the Second Amendment, we have a plethora of restrictions on just getting guns. I mean, here you have to go through a background check and you have to go through classes, when I should just be able to go and buy a gun.
But if you look, there are amendments that they follow, like women's right to vote. So, the whole thing with Convention of States is that we have a structural problem. And so we're aiming to fix that. And so they will be forced to follow the Constitution, and that's part of what we're doing. And so term limits is definitely going to take care of that. Okay? So
is there some sort of amendment where they can be outed from office if they do something like many of the Democrats, where I'm going to take away your Second Amendment rights? Sorry, bye, you're not following the Constitution.
no. To be honest with you, the commissioners during the convention will hammer out what the proposed amendments will be. At this point, it's just a meeting. It's nothing more than a meeting. And so, honestly, just so you know, a convention isn't going to cure everything that ails us. We've got a long way to go, but we have to start somewhere.
Right.
So definitely term limits will help. Getting rid of the bureaucracy, the entrenched bureaucracy will help. It's a start is what I can say to that. Will they go to convention and do away with the Second Amendment, the First Amendment? No, it can't happen.
Can I ask another question, or is there somebody else?
You're on a roll.
Is there safeguards when you go in? Because every state, my understanding is every state gets to send a representative, and then they all discuss what goes on, and then they decide what the amendment may or may not be. So is there a safeguard that they go in and they say, okay, we're only going to touch the Third Amendment, or whatever it is, and then they cannot touch any of the other amendments? Or if they go in to change the Constitution, are all the amendments open for change?
Well, one of the reasons why, and I didn't go into this, I'm glad you brought that up, but when these states pass the resolution calling for the convention, every state has to have virtually the same resolution listing these three things. So every state is passing this resolution based on, this is what we're going to discuss. Now, can somebody bring up something saying, throw out the First Amendment? Yeah, they can bring it out. But then they're going to say, that is not germane to what we're talking about. And if they ever did, I mean, if it ever did get that far, you'd have 34 states that would probably file a petition with the Supreme Court stopping it from doing it. And we do have a little bit of precedence kind of on how this would take place. If you go back to when I was in high school, when I was a senior, we were at that time, we're going through the Equal Rights Amendment. If you remember, we're trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. That got down to the final days, and it had hit at X number of years, and I can't remember what it was. I want to say 5 years, but I'm not sure on that. They were getting down to the end. They still needed 2 more states, but they were running out of time. They went back and tried to change that and said, let's give ourselves 1 more year to do this. Supreme Court said, no, that's not what you brought up. That's not what was brought in here. If you're going to change that, you go back to the beginning and start all over again. So we do have some precedents in that if you say this is the document you're going to use and now you want to alter it, then you got to go back to the other states and say, are you okay with us changing this thing? Now, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
There's nothing in the application that would allow them to get rid of those amendments. They have to stick within the purview of what the application is. If they don't stick to it, like what Greg said, the states will pull them back. They'll be called out of order, and the states, because they sign a commission which says what they're going for, and when they don't follow that commission, the states can pull them back, and in many cases file litigation against them. Go ahead, Greg. Sorry.
No, that's good. Good points. Thank you. Yes.
The Commerce Clause
Speaking
doesn't give the government any power over commerce. Okay? Wickard v. Filburn was a Supreme Court abomination that gave the court or gave the government power over commerce. Instead of regulating or making regular commerce, they took control of it because some farmer grew wheat, and the possibility that someday he might want to sell that across state lines became their justification for invading states' rights.
Exactly.
If you want to fix the government, first thing you have to do is get rid of the 17th Amendment. Okay? The moment that Woodrow Wilson made senators elected instead of selected, they took power away from the states. So term limits can be completely null and void if you just take away the Senate's power and give it back to the states.
Well, that would be a good thing to bring up to the convention. You know, take a look at this. Do we need an amendment to change this? And if we can get 3/4 of the states to agree with it, that'll happen. But what you said exactly right, and that goes back to what Jackie said. The Supreme Court judge makes a decision. Now all of a sudden, that's your Constitution.
Yes, but the Constitution doesn't give the courts any power to do that. They've just decided that because they wear black robes and they have fancy hats, they can make up anything they want to, like Dred Scott or Roe versus Wade or Kelo versus New London. Okay, they've just basically said, well, we're oligarchs and you're all our serfs, and we can do whatever we want to.
That's why we're trying to write the course. Has anybody read or heard of this book, Mark Levin's The Liberty Amendments? So Mark Levin has scoped out some suggested amendments, and he does address that very thing. So when I read this the first time, I could read like a couple pages and then I'd start to fall asleep. It's a pretty dry read, but after I was involved with Convention of States, I actually went back and read it, and I was flying through the pages because my understanding of legislation and legislators had grown exponentially. So I just want to share this with you if you don't mind. He's proposing an amendment to restore the Senate, establish term limits for Congress, an amendment to establish term limits for Supreme Court justices, supermajority legislative override, 2 amendments to limit federal spending and taxing, an amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy, an amendment to promote free enterprise, an amendment to protect private property, an amendment to grant the states authority to directly amend the Constitution, an amendment to grant the states authority to check Congress, an amendment to protect the vote. So these are just his suggestions, but, you know, that's the whole point of the convention, is to,
And most of what he proposes would be fixed by getting rid of the 17th Amendment, because that would directly turn power back to the states.
not if we have the structural problem. It isn't going to change Washington. You know how slick they are.
Well, you're dealing with, progressives are a religion. You're dealing with zealots. You're not going to reason with zealots.
Did you want to talk about this book a little bit too?
No,
Or just-
do you want to?
No.
Oh,
I mean, not that I don't. You're better at it.
Linda.
So, if the, if we the people, want things in addition to these three things, we have to start a new, convention of states?
If it's outside the scope of the application, yes.
So we would have to start this process all over again for additional things if we felt a need to.
Yes. And like I said, this isn't going to cure all that ails us. So I don't, for any stretch of the imagination, think that this is the only one that we can ever have, and then we'll be done. Got to start somewhere.
Yes, sir.
Do you think that a maximum wage for certain elected officials would be too radical? $125,000 a year.
$15 an hour would be good.
They don't make that much money.
I was thinking something like $125,000 a year, and they don't get paid; they just get it refilled at the end of the
Well,
month.
the way they get around that is Mitch McConnell and his wife, Elaine Chao, are direct subsidiaries of the Chinese government. That's how they got into the shipping industry, is the Chinese government granted them a shipping company. That's where they got their millions from.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm saying if they had
So-
a maximum wage, then they wouldn't be able to be influenced by that.
No, they would find a way to get
I
around
think-
that by having
yeah.
outside income.
And I think that's a good point when we get down to the convention. And I don't know how we're going to set this up to where we can let people like us put in suggestions. I suppose you would call whoever the commissioner is. But it's ideas like that when we get the convention called, if we don't get a convention called, everything else we're talking here is mute. I mean, let's face it. So once we get that done, though, then I think issues like that need to be brought into there to have them discussed. Yes, sir.
2 quick questions. Are there any other convention of states efforts at this point besides this one?
Yes.
Is there?
Yes. There's one that's been around for 37 years, the Balanced Budget Amendment. And for 37 years, they haven't been able to get it passed. There's also an effort for term limits only. Now, why we have the 3-part resolution is that if we just do the Balanced Budget Amendment, we know that Congress is pretty slick at trying to find workarounds. They would ruin the state budgets because they'd pass everything off on unfunded mandates. They can raise taxes. So again, we want to go after the structure problem. Term limits alone, again, a Band-Aid maybe? Did that answer your question?
That's the first one. The second one is, say we get 34 states. Do all 34 states have to exactly agree on what they're going to put out to Congress? Or, I mean, what are the chances of getting all 34 states to say term limits of 3 versus 5? Somebody walks away and says, if we're not doing 5, I'm out of here, so now we only have 33 and we're done?
Well, when we get to the convention of states, our work begins. That's when their real work begins. And because we're going to have 34 states who have passed this and do agree that these 3 issues need to be attacked or be addressed. But all 50 states are going to send delegates there and send commissioners.
So you have to have
Now,
34
of those-
to start it.
we have to have 34 to start it, but not to propose. Now, I think after that, and I don't remember, do they have to
Simple majority.
simple majority? But in reality,
Convention.
okay. But in reality, and I'm sure they're going to think about this too. They still got in the back of their mind, whatever proposals they come up with, amendments, they've got to have something that is palatable that 3/4 of the states would accept it. So if they sit down and they have one that this is going to pass 49, 50, 52, 48 with whatever, they'll probably stick back and say, no, this ain't going to do it. We got to come up with something that more people are going to support than this. I'm going to guess. Because after we go through all this work of putting this thing together and all the time negotiating this, I think they'll keep calling back to the table and tell, okay, what is your objection? Is how can we get this thing done to try to get it up?
And
That's
did you
my
say
thoughts.
Congress is in the middle of this someplace, even after we do this? Does Congress have to vote on any of this?
No,
Okay.
no.
This is to deal with Congress.
Right, I just want to make sure. Kind of stuff.
I think Congress can, I think Congress, the only thing they can do is determine, or is this up to states, can they determine how the vote goes out to the states?
They,
Or-
once the convention is over, they can say how the amendments would be ratified, either by put it out to the people, like they did with prohibition, or just vote within the state legislatures. More than likely, what I'm told by the people that know about legislative things, that probably the states would pass them within their own chambers, rather than put it out to the people.
Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, we've all got issues that we're passionate about, but it occurs to me that I think this is the right direction, or to get the term limits, to get rid of corporations being individuals. I was so disappointed. I thought John Roberts would nix that thing way back, but he didn't. He went and voted for corporations being individuals, and that was so disappointing, because the problem is they're all bought. I've got other issues that I'm passionate about. You were Second Amendment. We've got to just stop these guys.
Yeah. And that's where, from my opinion, if we can get this done to bring decisions back to the states, the people who are going to be opposed to this, one is going to be, of course, the lifelong politicians, the Mitch McConnells and Nancy Pelosi, they don't want their gravy train interrupted. So they're going to be opposed to this thing. But another group that's going to be opposed to it is going to be the lobbyists that you say, because it's so much easier for them to walk to Washington and dump a few $1 million there and get their agenda than go to 50 states and have to do it. So it's going to take a lot of power away from lobbyists if we can bring those decision-making back to the states the way they were meant to be.
Well, it seems to me that the function of politicians has now become to get reelected. That is their only function.
Absolutely.
So I think we are way past the point that we are beyond taxation without representation. Why don't we hit them in that area? Because you can't do anything without our money. The only way you can change education is to break their financial back. It's the only way to get it back.
How do we get majority of Americans not to pay their taxes then?
Well, I would say this convention would be, when you look at imposed fiscal constraints, that could fall underneath that.
Mm-hmm.
So you take away their money, what are they going to do? They can't do anything. They'll
Well,
go
that's-
back to being
that's
elected
true, and
for a job instead of to get reelected.
And that issue is, there's going to have to be a lot of negotiating in there to try to get enough people to pass it.
Right.
We may end up with, it may not be, and again, my own opinion, I think it's going to be very, very, very difficult to get 38 states to agree on a balanced budget amendment. But I think you can get them to agree to set a limit to where our deficit can never exceed X percent of our GDP.
Yeah.
This is it. That's where you got to go. You got to make it work
And
within
start
that.
making-
And maybe every year after that you lower that percentage a half percent, to where you can finally get it back into line.
Right, but they don't
But
blink an
could be
eye at
anything.
$40 million for a 2-year investigation that proves nothing, but yet they can't figure
Yeah.
out how to fix our roads.
Yeah.
It's like, hello?
Just
And
so you know, there's a book that was written by Senator Tom Coburn from Oklahoma. He served in the House of Representatives and then went to the Senate. He term limited himself. He wrote this book called Smashing the DC Monopoly. It's well written and easy read. And the thing that really struck me when I read it is his statement that you get elected and you spend the length of your term raising money so you can get elected again. So that doesn't have anything to do with our taxes. So, you know, we're broken. We definitely have.
to be on a committee. They have to raise money to get on a.
Exactly, and then if they don't raise it, then they don't get the committees that they want.
Right.
So it's cattywampus.
I got to back up just a second. I got to back up for a second. Something I should have asked right away. Is there anybody in here that works in any of our House, our representatives, or senators' offices, or represents them? Because we invited some. Oh yeah, he's one of our guys.
But no House members.
No House members or anything here. Too bad.
We
Anyway, I'm
invited
sorry.
them.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we talk about how you want to reduce the size of the government. How do you reduce it? How do you say, okay, the Department of Education is wasting more money per student than any other country in the world, yet we are not even the top 20 out of any category in education. It needs to be gone. How do we get rid of it? The government's going to flip.
We started, when this nation began, the first 7 presidents, their cabinet was 5 people. Now, we've grown since then, fine, so you may have to add some more. We now have 15 cabinet level posts. But on top of that, depending on the president, who the president is, there is from 30 to 40 cabinet level positions that don't fit in the room. So, you know, and I think this is where our convention, that's one of the issues they're going to have to address as we talk about doing away with the bureaucracies, shrinking down the bureaucracies.
That's the second half of my question. Because you look at the elected officials as one problem. The bureaucracy is the other. So what you're saying is, okay, I get hired on by the federal government to do whatever in a senator's office, and then I work my way up. So what you're saying is, I'll never get a chance to work my way up. I can only work there for 5 years before I have to move on to another part of the government?
That'll be a negotiation at the convention. They'll have to figure that out because there'll be issues.
We're really talking about we're really talking about the agencies, the EPA. There are so many that are just bloated.
And there's a lot of them that are doubled. We have
exactly.
But how do we get rid of them?
Well, that's what happens in convention. They'll have to take a look at that. I don't have the brain to even consider what that might look like, and thank God that we do have people that will. In Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments, he addresses that, and I've read it twice, and I still can't articulate that to you. Read it.
But it was said that our children shall never, never, never be taught by the government.
Yeah. Well,
and yet
surprise.
we tear down our township schools.
Well, make a note of that. Make a note of that with when I talked about the agenda. That's exactly what they say in there.
Because the point is that we let it go.
Yeah.
We decided to let the federal government run our education.
That's what comes with the equal rights. Pass a law that says everybody deserves an education. Well, who's going to do it then? Right?
We should have done that.
That's right.
Yeah.
We were doing it well.
Well, we could go back to homeschool.
Go ahead.
Is it your hope that if we do get a first convention of states, right, that we have an annual convention of states or a regular set of these that so we can come and
Does it have to end?
You know, for yeah, it doesn't have to end.
I mean, people don't even know this exists, right? So say you get a quorum of people who say, "Wow, this is always an option for us." So every 5 years we want to come back and readdress.
It could be, but the way it would have to happen is this first convention, that would have to be one of the amendments that they would have to bring up. They'd have to bring up some kind, and I have no idea what it would say, but they'd have some kind of amendment saying that. But it still has to say in the Constitution how this function works.
Sure, but wouldn't you think that if there was even a remotely successful convention of states,
it would be easier to do another one.
It would be easier to do the next one, right? Wouldn't you say that's the hope of all of this? Is
that would be
we
great.
Can't get everything done the first one.
So you
Then
know,
we could become our own bureaucracy.
just so you know,
There's our goal.
just so you know, I want to share with you the mission statement for the Convention of States. They came out with this a couple years ago, and when I heard it, I was really upset because I thought the mission statement was to call a convention. Our mission statement is to build a strong, engaged army of self-governing grassroots activists. And I assert that we're here today because many of us, aka the silent majority, didn't stand up, didn't hold legislators accountable. And so after the convention is called, if we go back to sleep, we're going to end up here again, because the national populist progressives will never stop. They never stop. So that's our mission statement. If we call the convention, if we don't call the convention, but we build the grassroots, we're still successful, because we're going to hold our state officials accountable. And most people don't know what it means to be a grassroots activist. It always looks like somebody else, not me. And so that's what we try to do. The Minnesota Convention of States team and the teams all across the country is to grow the grassroots. There's power in that. We have over 19,500 supporters here in Minnesota, and we're looking to get more. So that's our mission statement. Then we have some aspirational goals that I want to share with you as long as I'm on goals. The people organize and restore representative government as defined in our written Constitution. So worthwhile. To restore a culture of self-governance in America. And then this is my most favorite, to inspire a political and spiritual awakening in America. So that's who we are and what we are. And so, your question is really kind of lost on me, because I'm hoping that in the meantime, and even after convention is called, we're still going to wake up the grassroots. Because we want to bring the power back to the states. It all boils down to who decides? Who decides? Do you want the decisions made here in Minnesota, or do you want them made in D.C.?
And we're gonna stay here for a while and answer questions afterwards. But some of you are probably wanting to get going. We've got your 45 minutes, but I want to bring it to a conclusion, at least this part, and then Jackie's got some other things that she wants to go over with you. One question that didn't come up, and I know I didn't come up in this group because we've got a bunch of supporters here, but in every town hall meeting we've always had the one person that says, runaway convention. What's going to happen if this convention puts out an amendment that I don't like? And here's the way I look at that. Is it possible for this convention to come up with an amendment that I find unpalatable? Yeah, it is very possible. But it still comes down to this one point, and that is, if 75% of the states want that amendment, then it should be, regardless of what I think it should be. Because if you don't have that, then you no longer have a democratic republic. You have an aristocracy or something else, which is what we have now. Right now we have, if we ask the states and we do surveys, and granted, we don't know what the amendments are going to be, but we've got the majority of the states agree with those 3 points. Everybody, majority of states agree with those 3. So if they agree with those 3, how come the Congress isn't presenting that now, presenting them something to vote on? They don't want to. They don't want to go down that path because they want to get reelected. For one thing, they want to get reelected so you don't make waves. So what we've got now is not a democratic republic. We've got an aristocracy. We've got a group of people in Washington to decide what you're going to vote on and what you're not going to vote on. So that's what we want to go through here. Now, the other thing, and I'm going to pass this over to Jackie. There's a lot of things facing our nation right now and a lot of problems. And we can have a discussion that go well into the evening, especially if we got beer. Because we get a lot smarter, or at least I do. But we can say that the biggest threat for our country is socialism, or the biggest threat to our country is liberalism, or the biggest threat is right-wing extremists. The biggest threat to our country is apathy. Because we'll all sit and say, somebody ought to do something about that. And that's where it sits. So, I'm sorry.
I would just like to make one comment, and that is, I don't know if all of you, any of you saw on Facebook, the woman who confronted Justin Amash recently at his town hall. We need people like that to go. We need to go to our town halls. We need to confront people who do not follow through on what they say they're going to do.
It doesn't always work. I did that to Colin Peterson, and it went nowhere.
Well, it may not work, but that doesn't mean we can't try. We still have to try.
I'll go with you next time. Call me.
We have to
I want to get in front of him. And I'm gonna hand it over to Jackie and let her take us home on this. But one last thing I want to say: for us to get successful for here, it's got to be a bipartisan effort. So keep that in mind as you're going out and as you're talking to people. Try to avoid left, right. Talk about the issues. Because I know that there's liberals that see we can't keep going on this debt. I know we have liberals that say these are too many people are in Washington too long. So we've got to try to keep this at the best you can. Keep it a nonpartisan. Keep it on the issues. Jackie, yours.
I just want to thank you for sacrificing your time to be here today. I know many of us drove quite a ways to get here, and this is really important. And I often think about our founders, and what happened when our nation was being founded, and we had to go up against the most powerful army in the world. Many of them with pitchforks or hoes or whatever, and I think it's as critical, if not more, than that, but it's not nearly as dangerous. So I'm going to ask people to be bold, find your voice, and when you join the Minnesota team, we have lots of support, and we need more, but we have lots of support. We'll train you. We'll find a spot that will fit you, with the time that you have available, your skills and ability. And so there's that part of it. And then also know that this is the team that you can join where you know that your efforts are making a difference, a huge difference. And so we're working really hard, so I'd like you to consider joining us. We're going to hold you hostage today until we brought some cards and we prepared them for you. We made reference to who we are, Convention of States. We put our website on there. We're going to ask you to sign them with your names and addresses, and we're going to send those to your legislators. We, by the way, did invite the 4 House members for the district that we targeted and the 2 senators. Senator Lang called yesterday with regrets. He's away at reserves and couldn't make it. So I wanted you to know, those of you that are constituents of his. And so when the legislators receive a handwritten note or letter from their constituents, it has a lot of weight behind it. So think about why you would want this. I'm concerned about the direction we're heading. Please support this. And everything is already listed in there, so you don't have to write everything all over again. We did the legwork for you. So if you would, please take the time. You'll need one to your House rep, and you'll need another one to your state senator. So you'll be doing 2 cards each. Okay?
And I said I was done. I'm sorry. I don't follow my agenda. 30 more seconds. I just want to show you the sheet that I gave you. Go to the very back page. Our website has got everything you need for support, but it is so big it's hard to find stuff. So I just wrote a few things there that I go into and what I find in there. And notice on there the one, if I would point out just one, Antonin Scalia has got some videos. Be sure to go on there and listen to those. It's all.
Did you have more of those for those that was
Yeah.
Lastly, there are some of you in here that haven't signed the petition, and those of you that haven't, are you now willing to do so? We have petitions here. Wonderful. Miles
I've
over
got more
there
up here,
has
so.
the petitions, so I just want to tell you that Miles is he'll be a senior next year in high school, and he's a district captain on our team. We have Linda here. Linda is a new district captain to our team as of a week or so ago. We have Nina back there handing out papers. She's a regional captain. Behind the camera, we have Rick Jensen. He's our state videographer. And then, of course, we have Greg, district captain in his area. So we're growing, and we need more. So hello there. You made it. Okay, so that's it, and I want to thank people on Facebook for watching us. That concludes the Facebook portion of the show. God bless y'all.
Yes.
You made a comment